Yeah, I was pretty involved in competitive soccer growing up. And so when I think about competition, at least, or that striving, part of being a 3, I wonder if, some of that was just soccer was so all encompassing in my life and competitive. And then, trying to make great grades at the same time and being involved in activities in high school, which was certainly something I did. I don't think I ever viewed me being all that different than many of my peers in that regard, frankly. So it just felt normal in the culture I was in. When I got to college, and I went to a small college where you could do lots of things. One of the reasons I chose it is I knew I want to do it all. I don't want somebody to tell me if I play soccer in college, I can't do anything else. And so, I was in multiple organizations in a leadership role, playing soccer competitively and doing all these things. And I think one time when I realized maybe this isn't typical or normal is when my academic advisor pulled me aside when we were registering for classes and I was sharing all the things I was going to do the next semester. I remember her saying, in her gentle way, Chad, you're the poster child for over-involvement on campus. I think my ears heard that as a compliment initially, and I think I walked out of her office saying, I think she was trying to tell me this maybe isn't helpful or normal or great.
Welcome to the Story Enneagram podcast. I'm Jim Gum, and I'm an Enneagram trainer and executive and life coach living in Kansas City. Today, we're going to hear from some social 3s as part of this season's series on the social subtypes. The Enneagram social 3 is called Prestige. They enjoy taking the lead and being seen as competent and accomplished, especially early in their careers. Vanity is the passion of Enneagram Type 3s, and in this social subtype, it presents as a persona where the individual is playing the role of what they believe will be received as ideal. As you heard from Chad in the introduction, his activity level just felt normal to him, and he rarely took time to consider the cost. Have you ever worked hard to get to a certain degree of success and then asked yourself, was it worth it? Today, we'll hear from some social 3s as they share about their own drives, successes, and failures, and how they've reflected upon it over time. Who am I? Is a question we all ask ourselves from time to time. And this can be hard for Enneagram 3s. For the heart types, it matters how we're being received. Listen to the pressure that Stephanie felt as a young engineer.
And I remember the moment that it really hit me was incredibly humbling. At this point in my life, I am a young engineer, the only female in the basement offices of the maintenance and engineering space of a manufacturing plant. I'm a mom. I'm managing a team of 60 union mechanics and electricians, and I've got a lot to prove because it's a hard space, right? It's a really hard space to be working. As I was reading through this Enneagram Institute levels of health, one of the things that it said was as you become more unhealthy, you become desperate to prove that you are actually better than other people. And it was brutal. I mean, just reading that phrase at the moment in life when I was ready to hear it and realizing, oh crap, like this is absolutely me. When I feel threatened, I have to posture to regain my space in the world.
And here's how Matt describes how he feels the need to stand out.
Yeah, but you can really try, right? So one thing I do think is interesting in terms of the ways that vanity shows up for me is, in our current professional environments, there's all these ways in which we need to kind of make websites or pages or any of this sort of stuff. You can at least fool yourself that this is a presentation of self that can be massively controlled. And those kinds of moments for me are, I sense, and I could be wrong, but I sense that those are 5 times more anxiety producing for me than they would be for other people. That in some way I would be seen as someone who the viewer would not admire, someone unimpressive, someone ordinary, which, as soon as the words come out of my mouth, Jim, I know that it's okay to be ordinary, but it doesn't feel like it to me often. And much of my life has been a battle against being mediocre or ordinary. And there are parts of that I've really enjoyed, I've achieved a lot of things in my life that I'm really proud of. And much of the time it's motivated by good things, not just vanity. And I think some of it has been gifts to some of the things I've done, been gifts to other people, and care a lot about my students and my family. And, I'm proud of parts of that. Right. But there are also these other elements of it that are sometimes a little bit sinister. And those are places I do get stuck, which is a weird thing to say at 44,
Here's Chad again sharing about how he experiences both the strengths and pitfalls of being a performer.
I think the characteristics around achievement, around perception, and the ability to be pretty comfortable walking into almost any situation and figuring out a way to read. I don't think that happens consciously necessarily for me at all. I think that just happens that, I can be comfortable in this room and make other people comfortable. And I want them to perceive me as non-anxious presence. I want them to think well of me, and I think there's a little bit of achievement, goal-driven. How do I stack up? That's all just been hardwired into me, whether I think about it or not, I think. So if that's 3 behavior, that would apply. Giving a presentation in a board meeting and you realize you just threw a grenade out there that you shouldn't have, or somebody in the room is wanting you to do something different than you're doing. They clearly had a different perception of how things should go and how things should be. And I'm standing up there realizing their hand's about to go up and it's coming. And I thought, I did not prep for what I'm about to hear. And I feel like I'm so confident in the moment that I can handle things that, I really have to remind myself to prepare. I really have to think about this. Like, you're not just going to walk in there and read the room because you're a 3 and make it all work. You have to be prepared. And that's work for me.
Enneagram 3s are competitive. If they're going to do something, they want to do it well and succeed. The thing that gets a 3's attention is failure. Formal evaluations can be tricky for a 3. Listen to the contrast in these 2 stories. Here's how Stephanie experienced the process at one of her jobs.
3s, everyone fears failure, but no one fears failure more than a 3, because for a 3, failure is absolutely soul-crushingly, devastatingly unsurvivable. Everyone else is afraid of failure. That is a common thing, but it is completely different for 3s. I like to think of the performance appraisal process as a really good example of that. Always a top-notch student, actually never straight A's because I was pursuing all of the leadership activities too and didn't prioritize homework as much. So I got really good grades, but I wasn't a valedictorian because that's not what I valued. What I valued was showing up in the space as a leader and being able to do as many activities as possible. And that was what I prioritized. So then when you get out into the workplace, you're not getting report cards and accolades, et cetera. You might get some performance reviews, and I coveted them early in my career. It was so incredibly important. And then I would just pore over every single word, really trying to decipher what exactly were they saying and what did I need to do. And, kind of this balance of both defensiveness of like, what do you mean I didn't do that well? Of course I did that well. I'm amazing. Compared to then, the flip side of like, I'm falling apart because you said I didn't do that well. Right? It's this oscillation that I experienced in my early 20s that was kind of emotionally, it was emotionally devastating, or like whiplash. You're allowing this thing to speak into your life in a way that has way more power than it should.
And here's Matt again.
When I'm most in my personality and not in my essence, negative feedback is just devastating. Even if it's the minority report. It's one of the reasons I think that in an earlier period in my life, for a variety of reasons, I'm not pursuing, at this point in my life, a career in ministry. But the idea of being involved with hundreds of people, it just too terrifying, right? Like that big of an audience is just would be too much to manage, because when the feedback comes that's negative, it's I am a failure, and and that catalyzes a whole process of trying to re-narrate and outflank that's really exhausting and emotionally draining to try and deal with that. I mean, to give you a very vivid example of this, I mean, as a professor, we get evaluations from students, and it doesn't matter if I can figure out that the evaluation came from a student who came to half the classes and did a quarter of the reading. If what they write to my department chair and the provost is, "This was an okay class," it hurts way more than it should. Like way more than it should.
Listen to how Chad experienced his work-related golf outings.
I also think that the big thing I learned was, there is also a little bit of avoid things where you're not going to succeed. And, so risk, failure is not really anything I'm all that interested in, frankly. So that keeps you from probably trying things or putting yourself in positions where you're not going to be successful. And so for me, that was a big sort of takeaway as I looked back. I quit playing golf about 15 years ago. I would go with my boss and we'd entertain folks and play. And I'd say, I shouldn't be on this course. This is way too nice for me. And these guys aren't going to want to play with me. And I'd say, don't worry about it. We're just out here to have fun. Don't worry about it. I joke, I still shouldn't be playing. The day I quit, one day I'm on the tee and I say, the nice thing about this course is the houses aren't so far up on the fairway that you can hit them. And I shank one, perpendicular off the tee box up onto somebody's back porch after I said that. And at the end of the drive home, I said, I shouldn't be playing. And he kind of went, well, he kind of said, maybe.
Three's sensitivity to failure can make them unconsciously work to create the image of success. Here's how Matt says it shows up as an English professor.
I've got an unbelievable bookshelf and library in my office, and I have one in my house too. And I think of them as something kind of like a hologram of my mind. And I don't want that to sound arrogant, though I'm sure it probably does. But there's a way in which that's a kind of presentation of impressiveness that I'm happy to display, right? And I think for me, that's probably a pretty vivid example of, in my field, what this looks like. That's very different than, the sort of more common trappings of success. There was a long period of my career where I always worked with the door open because I wanted everyone to see that I was the first person there and the last person to leave. On one hand, these are employers. I wanted them to respect and admire me. And also, and this is just honest, I think there's part of me that likes being kind of intimidating. I kind of like looking commanding and impressive at times in ways that I don't know that this is not something I'm necessarily proud of, but it's something I'm able to at least articulate that's part of my struggle is why do I need to feel something like that, or what's the drive for that?
Threes have an opportunity to let go of their appearances when they begin to ask themselves who their real audience is. Failure can be a door opener to some deeper change. Stephanie shares a story about her first internship.
So I have this bottle cap. It says, "You will always be successful in your professional career." This bottle cap I opened off of a bottle when I was an intern, and I've kept it because that day in my internship, I was told by my mentor that they would not hire me unless something changed. It was the first moment of failure in my life ever. This was like you have gotten a job offer from every single interview you have done in your life. You landed this internship and you thought you were knocking it out of the park. And we are 6 weeks into this 12-week internship and you are failing. And I completely lost my mind. I had to leave. It was 4:00 in the afternoon. So I just left work, like sobbing, couldn't even drive home. I was just crying in the car. And then figuring out how to work through that, and then going back to my boss, asking what the metrics were they were looking for, figuring out how to meet that. I ended up doing fantastic and I got a job from that company, et cetera, right? Like that's because I'm a 3. That's just what happens. Working through the challenge of that, I've always kept this because it's ironic. You will always be successful in your professional career on the one day that I was told that I would not be hired as a full-time employee. And that to me, I think has kind of been the epitome of my 3-ness here, and why I keep it on the shelf is that failure is not contradictory to success, right? It is often the through way in which you get there, and success doesn't always look like a linear path. I mean, that was probably one of my most pivotal moments in my life.
Matt shares a story about how a simple oversight on his part offered him the opportunity to experience acceptance and approval, even in failure.
Just to give an example, though, I think of where not being impressive has been okay. And I got up and started talking about 2 short stories, and my class was looking at me every time I mentioned one title, and they're looking at me with totally blank eyes. And I could not figure out what was going on. I went back to my office and realized that I was convinced I had sent them an email making an adjustment to the reading, and I had not clicked send. So they were lost. And it was a complete fail, the next class. And I just stood up and said, I am really sorry. I messed that up. I don't know that I've done that before, but I deeply apologize, and I hope I won't do it again. And I don't know what else to say, but we're going to keep going on with class, but please accept my apology. And guess what? They did. And it was totally fine. That kind of moment for me to be able to admit to being unimpressive and failing at some small professional task. And it was, probably 20 minutes of their time that was wasted. And they forgave me for it. And we're having a great semester. And I think that's, for someone like me, that's incredibly healing.
And here's Chad again.
Why am I doing that again? Or who is that for? And so I'm much more aware of that undercurrent of if you got a PhD, but nobody knew. I mean, I don't go around asking people to call me Dr. Jolly, but on the other hand, I am Dr. Jolly, so what do you do with that, right? Or why did I go through that? What does that get me? There's a little bit of that was really hard work. And I'm even on this, see what I did there, right? I just mentioned that I have a PhD. I didn't have to do that on your podcast. But so you sit there and you think, how do I let people know who I am? Because nobody cares. I mean, that's the big learning. Because people don't really care what my resume is or anything done. And so, just kind of coming to grips with, well, then who are you, Chad? Who can you be to them? Where are you relationally with them? And who do you want to be in their lives? And how can you be a positive force, and whether that's kids, spouse, parents, neighbors, there's probably a little bit of reorienting your own, how you think about your public persona or private persona is probably different for a 3 than people who really maybe don't even think about it at all.
The 3's journey is a little like the story of Pinocchio, the wooden toy who becomes a real boy. The audience that the 3 is so hyper aware of really doesn't get to determine who the 3 is. And that audience isn't necessarily looking for an impressive paragon of achievement. They're looking for a real person, one who succeeds and fails, one who may work hard, but also knows that the most important things in life cannot be measured with accomplishments or degrees, but with real human connection. Not a persona, but a real person. That's it for this episode of the Story Enneagram podcast. Thanks for listening. If you or someone you know is a 3 who struggles with spending their energy pleasing others with their performance, you've come to the right place. Isn't it time to let go of the need to impress? Visit my website at storyenneagram.com. Set up a free inquiry call to explore coaching for executives, individuals, or couples. We can also talk about bringing the Enneagram to the team at your workplace. I'm sure we can tailor something that will make an impact. Please subscribe to the Story Enneagram podcast. Share it with your friends and family. And if you're really feeling it, leave a rating in Apple Podcasts. I'd appreciate it. Our music is by Daniel Gum. You can hear his music on Spotify or wherever you get your music. And yes, we do have the same last name. Story Enneagram, where learning your type is just the beginning of a whole new story.